Chapter 7: Music in the Holocaust and the Holocaust in Music. The seventh in a series of podcasts on the history and nature of Jewish choral music. In Chapter 7, we will look at choral music that reflects the Jewish experience of the Nazi Holocaust. For some Jews trapped in Europe during the Nazi Holocaust, music was a means of expressing pain and anguish. For some, music was a means of expressing hope. For some, music was a means of maintaining one's humanity. And for some, during and after the war, music was the medium through which one could vent one's feelings of horror and outrage, of grief and mourning. We will attempt to explore some of the musical phenomena that arose out of the experience of the Holocaust, Hitler's war against the Jews, and others who, for a variety of reasons, were considered unfit to live on this planet. The Nazis imagined that they had a utopian dream. They would start the human race over again. After purging humanity of all imperfect specimens, they would repopulate the world with a race of supermen. Of course, it was the exclusive prerogative of the Nazi elite to define who was perfect and who was subhuman. The achievements of the Aryan race in all spheres of human activity, from warfare through music, were seen as proof that this was the one race that deserved to rule the world. But if the Aryan race was to be the sole legitimate heir to humanity, it had to be demonstrated that all other races were inferior. Any human activity that was not Aryan had to be proven to be degenerate in order to justify its extinction. The Nazis waged political and cultural war, not only against their neighbors in Europe, but also against foreign elements that had been perverting the pure German culture. The Jewish-born German composer Arnold Schoenberg had introduced dodecaphonic modernism into German music, and, as a teacher in the conservatory, was passing this degenerate and unpopular musical style to the next generation. The Jewish composer Kurt Weill was introducing the strains of degenerate African-American jazz into the German opera and operetta, with such works as the Three-Penny Opera. In October 1925, the following article by Alfred Heuss appeared in the Berlin magazine Zeitschrift für Musik. The appointment of Arnold Schoenberg as director of one of the three master classes for composition at the Prussian Academy of the Arts in Berlin strikes a blow against the cause of German music that is so provocative in nature, it would be difficult to imagine anything worse in the present situation. This is a contest of strength between Germandom and now we must also be quite frank, the specifically Jewish spirit in music. Joseph Goebbels, as Minister for People's Enlightenment and Propaganda, was determined to eliminate alien influences on German music. Jews would be purged from their positions as music teachers, performers, composers, and scholars. In 1933, composer Richard Strauss was named the first president of the Rijksmuziekkammer, the National Ministry of Music, and conductor Wilhelm Furtwängler was named his deputy. The Rijksmuziekkammer introduced a succession of policies aimed at protecting Aryan culture from any alien acculturation. All Jews holding positions of influence within German musical life were expelled from their posts. Their performances would no longer be heard on the radio, nor would their recordings be available in stores. Here is a partial list of Jewish musicians who fled the Nazi regime. Music written by composers of Jewish blood was banned. In Frankfurt, Alfred Rosenberg set up a quasi-academic organization, the Institut zur Erforschung der Judenfrage, the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question. Musicologists working at the Institute were commissioned to publish a Lexicon of Jews in Music. This became an invaluable reference work for radio programmers, distributors of sheet music and records, and any musician planning repertoire for a public concert, anyone who had to ensure the absence of Jewish music. In 1937, Hans Ziegler organized an exhibit of degenerate music, Entartete Kunst, in Berlin. The day before the exhibition started, Hitler delivered a speech declaring merciless war on cultural disintegration, attacking chatterboxes, dilettantes, and art swindlers. Degenerate art indicated works that insult German feeling or destroy or confuse natural form, or simply reveal an absence of adequate manual and artistic skill. But in effect, it covered modernist art or any art created by a non-Aryan. Then, in 1938, Hans Ziegler organized an exhibit of degenerate music, Entartete Musik, in Düsseldorf. Visitors to the exhibit could see and hear examples of what Ziegler called the artistic aspects of cultural Bolshevism and the triumph of Jewish impudence. The poster of the exhibit conflates Jews with blacks, using racial stereotypes and implicitly condemning jazz.
Wir haben ein deutsches Theater, einen deutschen Film, eine deutsche Presse, ein deutsches Schrifttum, eine deutsche bildende Kunst, eine deutsche Musik und einen deutschen Rundfunk. Der früher oft gegen uns vorgebrachte Einwand, es gäbe keine Möglichkeit, die Juden aus dem Kunst- und Kulturleben zu beseitigen, weil deren zu viele seien und wir die leeren Plätze nicht neu besetzen könnten, ist glänzend widerlegt worden.
In 1937, Hitler and Goebbels put a final touch to their cunningly orchestrated attack on the arts. With a godlike authority, they declared modern art had no place in German culture. The Reich must be rid of this decadent byproduct of Bolshevik Jewish corruption. Rid, too, of the depraved influence of blacks and their hated jazz. To prove their point, a massive exhibition of Entartete Kunst, degenerate art, was staged in Munich. The term Entartung had been coined by a 19th century doctor and criminologist to describe a state of almost clinical abnormality. Nazi ideologists appropriated the word to revile that which frightened them most: original, independent thinking, free expression, and, of course, anything created by a Jew. Thousands flocked to see work that included satire, caricature, and expressionism. The exhibits hung, exposed and punished, crammed on the walls and defiled by the curators with crude slogans and puerile insults. The public could not conceal their fascination with this terrible, forbidden art.
Through the gaily decorated streets, a procession symbolizing aspects of national history made its way through cheering crowds. Men in armor, troops on horseback, music and flags, all were there in this dazzling parade of history.
In contrast, the great German art exhibitions showed art as exemplified by the Reich. Obedient to a non-existent ideal, here was the work of technically brilliant artists realizing empty visions, their boredom transparent in every brushstroke. The new approved art was passionless propaganda, bland and voyeuristically remote.
And what they detested was, on one side, was the actuality of the art, whereas they liked the eternity of the art. They wanted organic art. They wanted the art related to the race.
In 1938, the Anschluss sealed the unification of Austria and Germany, and a smaller exhibition, this time of Entartete Musik, degenerate music, was paraded before the world in Düsseldorf.
There were the opera composers, there were also the operetta composers, the light music, there was jazz, there was 12-tone music, there was Hindemith, Stravinsky. All of these were labeled under this word Entartete Musik.
Music by Bertolt Goldschmidt, Jew, out. Entartet or not.
Nazism was whatever sustained the regime in power, and the same principle, or rather lack of principle, applied to the definition of Entartete Musik. So Entartete Musik was the agglomeration of prejudices that the Nazi leaders, not just Goebbels, but various others who fed in their own hatreds, deemed to be unperformable and to be banned in Germany. So, the perfectly, respectably German and Aryan Catholic Ernst Krenek could not be performed because he'd written an opera, Johnny Spielt auf, in which the central character was black.
Wiener und Wienerinnen, unsere Staatsoper ist einer frechen jüdisch-negerischen Besudelung zum Opfer gefallen. Riesenprotestkundgebung.
Arnold Schoenberg had abandoned his Judaism in 1892 at the age of 18 when he converted to Protestantism. But in 1921, a disturbing incident gave Schoenberg pause to reconsider his identity. When he took his family for a summer vacation at the lakeside resort of Matzeh, he was turned away, informed that the area was restricted to bona fide Aryans. Shortly thereafter he wrote, "I have at last learned the lesson that has been forced upon me during this year, and I shall not ever forget it. It is that I am not a German, not even a European, but I am a Jew." In 1933, when the Berlin Academy of Music announced its policy of purging all Jewish elements, Schoenberg resigned his teaching position and left Germany forever. On July 24, 1933, at a ceremony in a Paris synagogue, the composer officially re-entered into the community of Israel. Later that year, Schoenberg moved to the United States, where he would live out the rest of his years. Schoenberg wrote several choral works inspired by his newfound Jewish identity, including A Survivor from Warsaw, Kol Nidre, and De Profundis. On June 23, 1933, the Nazi government in Berlin agreed to the establishment of the Kulturbund Deutscher Juden, the Jewish Cultural Organization, also known as the Jüdische Kulturbund, the Jewish Culture League. The organization would provide employment for Jewish actors, musicians, and entertainers who had recently lost their jobs after the promulgation of the Nuremberg racial laws, and would provide performances for the Jews of Berlin who were no longer allowed in regular theaters and concert halls. The performances took place at authorized segregated venues with Jewish-only attendance. In Berlin alone, the Kulturbund provided employment for 125 musicians and actors. In its first year, it presented 69 opera performances and 117 concerts. Soon other branches were formed in Frankfurt, Cologne, Hamburg, and Munich. The Kulturbund continued to operate until 1941, when harsher measures were enacted against the Jews of Germany. In 1933, Ludwig Misch founded the Jewish Madrigal Choir in Berlin. In December 1934, they performed for the Kulturbund and then recorded Schubert's Hebrew setting of Psalm 92.
And in 1933, when Hitler came to power, I was still studying. And in 1933, all the Jewish artists were fired, all musicians, all professionals, all the businesses were taken away. And till this day, it's not quite known why the Nazis allowed the Jews to form an organization which was called the Jüdische Kulturbund, the Jewish Culture Association. There was a drama section, there was an orchestra, and an opera company, and cabaret, and lectures, and films were shown. It was really a godsend for the people who lost their jobs. By the way, we were not allowed to perform German composers. We couldn't contaminate the German music. We couldn't perform German authors.
That was the reason?
That was forbidden. We could only do like we did French, Russian.
How did they pick the artists who would be in Kulturbund? I mean, how were they chosen?
People auditioned, and if they were okay, they took them. And some had big names in the general music world. Some were known opera singers, in the German opera. This was a performance only for Jews and by Jews. And Jews could buy a subscription. And they had to have an identification card with a picture. And in every performance there was a Gestapo man watching. And my friend, a colleague of mine, whose picture I'll show you, told me that one of them came over to her and gave her such a compliment, how much he enjoyed the performance. There was a Jewish cultural life.
In November of 1941, shortly after invading Czechoslovakia, the Nazis evacuated Terezin, or Theresienstadt as it was called in German, and transformed that ancient walled city into a huge transit camp. Terezin would provide a convenient holding pen for the Jews of Bohemia and Moravia until they could be shipped to the east, where the death camps in Poland were already running at full capacity. A year later, it occurred to the Germans to use Terezin as a model camp, a facade to hide the truth of the extermination of European Jewry. Terezin is only about 40 miles away from Prague. More than 100,000 Jews were sent to Terezin, including many prominent writers, scholars, and musicians. Of the 150,000 men, women, and children who were sent to Terezin between 1941 and 1945, only 11,000 survived. The rest either perished from malnutrition and disease in the ghetto or were sent to the death camps in Poland. In Terezin, the Nazis allowed the inmates to organize cultural activities and produce concerts. In 1942, the Nazis even organized Freizeitgestaltung, the administration of free time activities, making such activities officially sanctioned. There were choirs, chamber ensembles of all types, orchestras, opera companies, a cabaret, and even a jazz band called the Ghetto Swingers. The prisoners' performances were featured in a Nazi propaganda film called The Führer Gives the Jews a City, and inspectors from the International Red Cross were fooled, seeing only flower gardens, schools, concerts, cafes, and healthy people. So the Nazis were using Terezin as a false front, a model camp, to show the world that Jews were actually being treated very well. The Nazis compelled artists to draw pictures of life in Terezin for propaganda use. But secretly, these same artists depicted the real situation. Here you see two depictions of what was called the coffee house. Here is the Terezin Choir performing Mendelssohn's oratorio Elijah as part of this propaganda film. The Terezin Choir also performed Verdi's Requiem. Rehearsals for the Requiem were held in cramped quarters after long days of hard labor. Chorus parts were painstakingly hand-copied. One never knew from day to day if any of the performers were still alive or if they had been sent to the death camps in the East. Baritone soloist Karl Berman described the process. We rehearsed in a very small basement into which the entire chorus was squeezed. Gideon Klein accompanied the rehearsals on a harmonium. For the concert, we moved to a hall with a very nice new piano. The story of these rehearsals and performances is unique in the history of music. The production had 3 performances, and always after a performance, half the chorus was transported to Auschwitz and was gassed. After the third performance, Gideon Klein, Raphael Schechter, the conductor, and I were transported to Auschwitz. Now, I am the only eyewitness alive who can tell about what happened there. At the age of 20, Gideon Klein was already considered one of the most promising young composers and pianists of his generation. But shortly after his graduation from the Prague Conservatory in 1939, the Nuremberg laws were enacted in the Nazi so-called Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. In December of 1941, Gideon Klein was deported to the Terezin concentration camp. Although initially assigned to the Aufbaukommando, whose task it was to build barracks for the growing number of Jewish prisoners, he soon became involved in the musical activities of the camp. One of the many works which Gideon Klein composed for the Terezin choirs was a Hebrew miniature for women's voices called Bachuri Le'an Tisa, written on December 3rd, 1942. A sketch of the score has been preserved. The poignant Hebrew text, indicating the uncertain future faced by the young men and women in Terezin, is underscored by the tragedy of Klein's own death in 1945 in the Fürstengrube concentration camp at the age of 25. Gideon Klein's sister, Eliška Kleinova, was also a musician. Unlike her brother, she survived the Nazi Holocaust. She told this author, "I consider it a very strange phenomenon that such magnificent works were created under these horrible circumstances. It's amazing that people are able to create such beauty while surrounded by such atrocities." Pavel Haas was born in Brno, Moravia in 1899. At the age of 21, he began to study with Leos Janáček, from whom Haas drew an enthusiasm for folk songs, particularly those of the newly independent Czechoslovak Republic. In 1941, Haas was deported to Terezin. On November 30th, 1942, Haas composed Al Sefod, a choral work for male voices, which he dedicated to Otter Zucker, deputy chairman of the Terezin Council. Its optimistic text, a new poem by the Palestinian Jew Yaakov Shimoni, is a vigorous exhortation to the people to free themselves from the lethargy of diaspora by working and reclaiming the land of Israel. On the cover is a touching and optimistic inscription in Hebrew, its letters created from the shapes of musical notes. It reads, "A souvenir of the first and last anniversary of our exile in Terezin." Viktor Ullmann was educated in Vienna, where he studied composition with Arnold Schoenberg and studied conducting with Alexander Zelinsky. In the 1930s, he was working in Prague. In 1942, he was deported to Terezin. In the camp, he was active as a composer, music critic, and conductor. His greatest work may be his satirical opera, The Emperor of Atlantis, composed in the camp. The opera was actually never performed in Terezin. When the Nazi overseers figured out the subversive nature of the opera, they shut it down and sent its creators to the Auschwitz death camp. Ullmann was asked to compose music for several of the Terezin choral groups. He wrote works for female chorus, male chorus, and mixed chorus, all fairly short, and all based on traditional Yiddish or Hebrew songs. Much simpler than Ullmann's instrumental works, these were Gebrauchmusik, accessible to the singers in the camp's amateur choirs. Here is Ullmann's arrangement for mixed chorus of a traditional paraliturgical song for the end of the Jewish Sabbath, Eliyahu Hanavi. Ullmann wrote of his experiences in Terezin, "It must be emphasized that Theresienstadt has served to enhance, not to impede, my musical activities. That by no means did we sit weeping on the banks of the waters of Babylon, and that our endeavor with respect to art was commensurate with our will to live." Hans Krasa studied piano and violin in Prague, and then composition with Alexander Zemlinsky and Albert Roussel in Berlin. And then he served for several years as a vocal coach at the New German Opera back in Prague. He began to achieve recognition as a composer, and his works were performed not only in his home city, but also in Zurich, Paris, and Boston. In 1942, Krasa was sent to the Terezin camp. There, he revived a children's opera that he had written in 1938 called Brundibar. The opera was performed for the first time in Terezin on September 23, 1943. After each performance, some members of the cast were transported to the death camps, and so new children had to be auditioned and rehearsed. The last performance was given in October 1944, just before the last of the children were deported to the death camps. In 12 months, there were a total of 55 performances. In the story, Pepíček and Aninka are victorious over the evil villain Brundibar, and that was a powerful message for the children imprisoned in Terezin. The teenage Rudolf Franek wrote in the children's secret weekly magazine called Vedem, "Everything could be summed up under the concept of Brundibar. You must face evil. One man alone is helpless. There must be more of us. The more, the better." Here is the finale of the opera as filmed by the Nazis in Terezin in 1944 for their propaganda. Now we turn to music in the death camps. In some of the death camps, the Nazi guards recruited inmates to perform in an orchestra. These ensembles had three functions: to distract and give false hope to the new arrivals, to energize the work gangs as they went off to forced labor, and to provide evening entertainment for the guards. But in some camps, the inmates organized their own music making. Rehearsing and performing in secret was a means of maintaining their humanity in the face of barbarous oppression. Martin Rosenberg was a Polish-born Jewish conductor who, under the pseudonym Rosberi Darguto, was conducting a workers' chorus in Neukölln, a suburb of Berlin. In 1939, he was arrested and sent to the nearby Sachsenhausen concentration camp, where he was brutally tortured. Soon after he recovered, Rosenberg organized and conducted a clandestine chorus of 25 prisoners. When he discovered that he and his singers were to be sent to the death camp at Auschwitz, Rosenberg composed a death song for the occasion. Jüdischer Todessang is based on an old Yiddish folk song called 10 Brüder, about 10 brothers who die one after the next. But in Rosenberg's version, they are murdered, one after another, in the gas chambers. What we know about Rosenberg and his choir and their last composition comes to us courtesy of Alexander Kulisiewicz, a non-Jewish political prisoner in Sachsenhausen who survived. From the diary of Kulisiewicz. This is what the first and, as it turned out, the last rehearsal looked like. Rosenberg, without further ado, gathered the choir and started a secret rehearsal. On this rainy October evening, when heaven seemed to be more gray and merciless than usual, people, shivering from cold, in heavy wooden clogs, looked upon their conductor with limitless trust, like children in a kindergarten visited by a long-awaited Santa Claus. Suddenly the conductor interrupted. Before the eyes of the whole choir, he took my hand in his and said, "Alex, remember, you are not a Jew, but you must sing my song all over the world until you die. Otherwise, you won't die in peace." Several drunken SS men burst into Block 39, screaming shrilly, "Alles raus!" Everyone out. Still singing, Jews were kicked, beaten up. Never again did I see the composer of Jüdischer Todessang. In the last moment, I managed to jump out through a window. As I ran away, shouting reached me from the Jewish barrack. I spent that night precisely memorizing every tone and every word of the unfinished song. Several hours later, a transport of 454 Jews left for Auschwitz. Among them was Rosenberg. He perished in 1943.
Martin Rosenberg was a Polish choral conductor who had made quite a reputation for himself before the war. But because he was a Jew and a socialist, he was taken by the SS to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. What does a choral conductor do? Even in a concentration camp, he forms a choir. He recruits a choir. He found a couple of dozen inmates that were willing to sing in secret after long days of backbreaking labor. When they found that they were going to be shipped off to the death camp at Auschwitz, Rosenberg wrote a special requiem, death song, for himself and his prisoners, based on an old Yiddish folk song called 10 Brüder.
Many composers have attempted, through music, to express their reactions to the horrors and the anguish of the Holocaust. One of the greatest of these monuments is A Survivor from Warsaw by Arnold Schoenberg. Just after the war, Schoenberg heard an eyewitness account of the final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto by one of the few survivors, a man who had escaped by living for months in the underground sewers. In 1947, the composer refashioned the survivor's tale into a dramatic cantata for large orchestra, speaker, and male choir. The speaker plays the double role of narrator and stormtrooper, using Sprechstimme to portray a chilling depiction of the final roundup. At the dramatic, hair-raising climax, the choir sings in unison a dodecaphonic setting of the Jewish prayer Shema Yisrael, creating a quasi-cubist distortion of the ancient chant.
I cannot remember everything. I must have been unconscious most of the time. I remember only the grandiose moment when they all started to sing as if prearranged. The old prayer they had neglected for so many years. The forgotten creed. But I have no recollection how I got underground to live in the sewers of Warsaw so long a time. The day began as usual. Reveille, when it still was dark. Get out, whether you slept or whether worries kept you awake the whole night. You had been separated from your children, from your wife, from your parents. You don't know what happened to them. How could you sleep? They shouted again. Get out! The sergeant will be furious! They came out, some very slow, the old ones, the sick men, some with nervous agility. They fear the sergeant, they hurry as much as they can. In vain. Much too much noise, much too much commotion, and not fast enough. The Feldwebel shouts, Achtung! Stillgestanden! Na, wird's mal! Oder soll ich mit dem Gewehr schon mal nachhelfen? Na gut, wenn ihr's durchhäusern wollt! The sergeant and his subordinates hit everyone, young or old, strong or sick, guilty or innocent. It was painful to hear the groaning and moaning. I heard it, though I had been hit very hard, so hard that I could not help falling down. We all on the ground, who could not stand up, were then beaten over the head I must have been unconscious. The next thing I knew was a soldier saying, "They are all dead." Whereupon the sergeant ordered to do away with us. There I lay aside, half conscious. It had become very still. Fear and pain. Then I heard the sergeant shouting, "Abzählen!" They started slowly and irregularly. 1, 2, 3, 4. Achtung! The sergeant shouted again. Russia! Nochmals von vorne anfangen! In einer Minute will ich wissen, wie viele ist durch Gaskammerablieferer! Abzählen! They began again, first slowly. 1, 2, 3, 4, became faster and faster, so fast that it finally sounded like a stampede of wild horses. And all of a sudden, in the middle of it, they began singing the Shema Yisrael!
Charles Davidson, a cantor composer in the Philadelphia area, created the well-known cantata I Never Saw Another Butterfly, a suite of 13 songs for children's choir and piano or orchestra. Composed in 1968, I Never Saw Another Butterfly is a sensitive setting of poems written by children in the Terezin concentration camp.
Another butterfly.
In the next chapter, we will look at choral music in Israel.